And we are live. Good afternoon, Scribblers. Thank you so much for tuning in to another exclusive box chat. I'm Lindsay Cummings, #1 New York Times bestselling author at HarperCollins and co-founder of Scribbler. Today we're meeting with agent Amy Tannenbaum. Amy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We're super excited to dive in. So right kind of at the beginning here, would you give our subscribers just a quick introduction to who you are?
Sure. So I'm a literary agent, as you said, at the Jane Rosen Agency. And I've been there for next year, it will be 10 years. And I represent mostly fiction, a little bit of nonfiction, but like 95% fiction in lots of different areas. So women's fiction, romance, suspense, thriller. It really runs the gamut. And before I was an agent, I was an editor. So on the other side of the business, I was an editor at Simon & Schuster for many years. And before that, I had a brief stint at Harlequin.
I love it. So you said you've been in the industry for over 15 years.
Yes.
How did you get started? And then we were talking about this, Scribblers, just before this chat, but kind of tell us how you went from the editor side of the industry to the agenting side. What made you want to make that switch?
Right. So, I always loved the idea of being an agent, the fact that you are working directly with authors, that you have much more autonomy as an agent than you generally do as an editor. So, when I want to take on a client, there isn't lots of like red tape or approval I need to go to. I pretty much, at least at the agency I'm at, can sign on whomever I want to sign on. Whereas being an editor, you really have to pitch the project to a much larger group, get lots of approvals, then make an offer. Then, it's not a sure thing whether your bid is going to win out and you'll be able to work on the project. So for me, it just felt like a more direct route toward getting to work with the authors that I want to work with as an agent. I love the fact that as an agent, you do tend to have a closer relationship with authors. So I always used to say that my favorite part of any day when I was an editor was when I was on the phone talking to authors. And I knew that as an agent, I would have so much more of that one-on-one time with authors. I just, working in a bigger corporation for me as an editor wasn't the environments that I loved working in. And I knew that being an agent, again, like I'd said, have more autonomy. There aren't as many people to report to. So I just felt like it would be a better fit.
I love that. And it's so true, even from the author side. Like I've had multiple different series under different umbrellas at HarperCollins. And I love the difference between, when you get an editor that you actually do get to talk to. It's like, oh, wow, I get a chance to actually speak to my editor on the phone or in person. Like it's so, I think a lot of authors might have the misconception that you get really close with your editors, but that's often not the case at all. It's more
right.
the agent that you have that relationship with.
Yeah. And to be fair to editors, they do have so much on their plate that takes them away from being able to interface directly with authors. They're in meetings so much of their day, and there's just so much administrative stuff to tend to on that end that you don't have to deal with as an agent. So you do have more flexibility and, open spots on your schedule to talk to your authors.
I cannot imagine balancing so many of them at one time. We have a lot of subscribers here. Obviously, I would say probably 99% of our subscribers have a dream of being an author or continuing their dream of being an author. So whether that is traditional or indie, they want to make a career out of it, a lot of us. So what is the best advice you have for someone listening who is just starting out, say they have a finished manuscript and they're ready to kind of decide which path to take? What's the best way for them to go about knowledgeably entering either indie or traditional? How do they choose which route they want to go?
Right. That's a great question. So I think it's really personal preference. So if you are someone who essentially wants to run your own business, going indie, I think is the better fit. So it's, you don't like giving up control when it comes to determining price, when it comes to even picking your title or cover design. Often, when you're with a publisher, you don't have complete control over those things. But if you're somebody who really just wants to focus on the writing piece, and have other, a whole team of people support you with everything else when it comes to like producing the book, selling the book, marketing the book, publicizing the book, then traditional is a better fit. Now, it isn't always entirely up to an author to be able to have the freedom to decide. It may be that you would prefer to have a traditional publisher, but whatever, for whatever the reason may be, you aren't able to find a traditional publisher. And it could just be that, what you've written maybe isn't the kind of project that traditional publishers are currently looking for, in which case you can go indie, and prove that actually there is a market for what you've written. And then, as many of my authors have done, go from indie to then traditional.
Yeah, for sure. That's what I started out as traditional and wanted to kind of experience the other side of the table there. So it's self-publishing for a little bit, and then that ended up becoming a book that got a deal back to traditional. So it's really fun and interesting to get to see all the different sides of it. We have a lot of questions. This one comes up a lot. What if an author gets into the game, say they realize, like, they go indie and they realize, okay, it's not for me. Maybe they want to go traditional, but they've already published some stuff and maybe it hasn't sold as well as they wish. The numbers aren't there. So the question is it too late for them to keep their name and go, just do that straight transition with a new book? Or do they need to try and go for a total rebrand, go with a pen name? How important are those numbers when you are wanting to make that shift?
I mean, that's a good question. And I don't think there's a one size fits all, because there are lots of like little factors that contribute to making a decision about whether or not you should completely rebrand yourself or stick with your current brands. But I will say, generally speaking, more than anything, more than what you've published before, the numbers you've had to date, is the manuscript that you are submitting to agents and then to publishers. So if your earlier books weren't as strong, or for whatever reason didn't have a strong following, but this new manuscript an agent sees a lot of promise in and thinks publishers will see a lot of promise in that project, and then I think it's fine to keep your name and not do a complete rebranding. So yes, that's what I would say. If you are writing something that's very similar to what you've written before that didn't perform well, then you may want to start fresh with a new name, a new packaging approach, in that case.
We just got a subscriber question that came in from Julie. What's a good first step for a writer who wants to be published but has no experience with the business side of publishing? I guess how do they learn that? How do you even get to the point where you feel like you can manage that?
So are they asking if it sounds like they're not asking specifically for indie versus traditional,
right.
or
Maybe they're just wondering, yeah, how do you learn and figure out kind of the way the industry works? Say you're talking to someone who's brand new to coming into this.
Right. So if you're writing in a specific genre, there are lots of writers groups. So there's the romance writers, or actually, I don't know if they're still active, but there are romance writing groups, for example, or like if you're writing mystery, there's Mystery Writers of America. So if you just go online and poke around, you'll find a lot of resources for writers looking to learn about the business. Writers and Poets is another one. Writer's Digest. So there are a lot of online resources. Something like Scribbler is another great way to learn about the business. If you do have a manuscript and find an agent, the agent's part of that job is certainly to educate you about the business. So you're not blindly signing a contract or, deciding which publisher is right for you. They really should hold your hand throughout that process and fill you in on all the aspects of the business. And then if you're self-publishing, there are also tons of resources for self-published authors. Specific self-published distributors have resources on their sites. So like KDP, Ingram, Nook Press, those are all places where you can release your books directly, self-publish them. And, everything you would want to know about that process is on their sites.
Yeah, for sure. And even just, diving into to Twitter or for
Yes.
Julie who asked this question, I think one of the things that somebody told me when I was first starting out is go to the back of any of the books that you love that maybe in a similar genre and find when they thank their agent. If
Yes.
that's and then you can kind of go down a really big rabbit hole on Google of just Googling and reading interviews with agents or, just you can go into blog posts and there's just so much that you can find if you just do a little digging.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great way to do it. And then also when you query those agents, if you mention that you're a fan of that writer who they also represent, or you find that your writing is similar to that writer who they represent, that's that's a very strong selling point to include in your query letter.
So you come with an editorial background into agenting, which I love. So there are quite a few agents out there who like to get really editorial with their clients. So when
Hmm.
you go into reading a submission, how much wiggle room is there for you with editorial changes, knowing that you have that background and like and you have experience with helping a book shine?
Hmm.
Do you sign somebody on right away if you see a book that is kind of like a diamond in the rough, but it needs work? Do you do revise and resubmits? Like what what's your process with that?
So I usually won't sign if an author is a debut and they don't have an established track record. If the manuscript feels strong, but I feel like it needs a fairly significant amount of work, I will request edits and then have them revise and resubmit before officially signing them on. Um, if it's someone who's established and I know, they've had experience working with an editor and a publisher or an agent, um, then I can feel, more confident that they're okay with edits and, can more um, successfully execute edits, then, I'm more likely to sign somebody on before they do the revise and resubmit. But, I really don't sign on authors who require a lot of editorial work, um, because I just, it's a lot of, it is a lot of that's a lot of heavy lifting and time consuming. So to be quite frank, a manuscript has to be pretty clean for me to sign on a client.
Would you say, just if you could come up with like a ratio of queries that come through in the manuscripts that you read, the ones that you pass on, how many of them are like, oh my gosh, this is polished and they were ready to submit this? And then how many do you think,
Hmm.
oh, they really, went way too early with this?
I would say, like, if I get 20 queries in a day, like maybe five, I think, are really polished,
Hmm.
maybe even fewer than five.
Why do you think
So
why do you think that is? Do you think authors are just, just excited and eager? Or do you think that people will struggle to go through that self-editing process?
I'm really not sure. I think something that's so helpful is being in these writers groups and consulting with other writers, and just getting another pair of eyes on your work. Because I know it, especially if you're so close to a project, it can be really
Mhm.
hard to self-edit. So I very much encourage, joining writing groups and just getting a fresh pair of eyes on your work before you send it out.
Yeah, and Scribblers, for those listening, even if you can't find, I would say, especially now, if you can't find an in-person one, online is where I've met so many of my critique partners.
Hmm.
It's just there's so many. I mean, we're all writers. We're sitting on our laptops all day, so it's a perfect place to find other people in the community, whether it's through Instagram, Twitter, the Scribbler Facebook group. There's lots of chances out there to find someone. So,
Definitely.
Amy, what what do you think are some of the common issues that you run into with first-time clients or debut authors when you're diving into prepping a book to go out on submission? Is there like a common theme of something that people need to work on a little bit more?
Hmm. Um, huh. I don't know that there's been a common theme. Um, I will say that just, working in the business, I have a perspective that I think is difficult to have if you work outside of the business. So, there's sometimes I'll give feedback based on what I know publishers happen to specifically be looking for, because they know retailers are specifically looking for something. And unless you're like really in the business and talking to editors and getting that kind of like business feedback, it's hard to know that from the outside. So, I would just say one thing, that like, even if an author has written a manuscript that's like super, super polished and well done, there could be things that are just a no-go for publishers right now. So for example, I was getting a lot of queries at the beginning of the pandemic about pandemics. And publishers just did not want to touch them. They felt like, readers, they wanted an escape from what was going on in the real world, and they just didn't want to touch it. So no matter like how well a manuscript about a pandemic was written, it just wasn't something I thought we should send out.
That is a perfect example. And I think that's so true. Everything I was watching at the beginning of that, watching or reading just happy, funny things.
Right. Yeah.
I wonder, has there been an uptick in contemporary, like those happy, funny types of books?
Yes. I think publishers really, they're looking, it's not to say that, darker books are not being acquired, they are, but readers and publishers, I mean, editors are readers too, right? So editors are reading through the lens of like, okay, what do my consumers want to buy? And so they're looking, they're imagining that their readers like them want to escape from all the heaviness in the world right now. And they are particularly hungry for those books that provide a great escape.
I'm really curious to know, how has the industry changed after the start of COVID, with a lot of in-person things having stopped? Have y'all seen like a decline of physical book sales, or like an uptick in, authors that are doing really successful with ebooks?
You know what? Actually, the opposite is
Oh, wow.
true. The book business is doing extraordinarily well. The publishers are breaking records across the board in terms of sales. So yeah, it's actually the pandemic, it threw things off kilter initially. And of course there are some paper and printing issues that have caused delays, but overall, the publishers and authors are doing really well right now.
I love it. That's so exciting.
Yeah.
What kind of submissions, just for those writers that are listening, what's really popular or really hot right now that's coming through your desk all the time?
In terms of what publishers are looking for?
Yeah, let's go from both sides of the board. What writers do you through queries? What are you seeing like a lot of? And then what are publishers looking for right now that they're really excited about?
Yeah. So, I mean, what publishers are looking for is usually what I'm looking for because it's my job to sell the projects, right? So, it's what I'm looking for and what publishers are looking for is not really all that different from what they're usually looking for. So, books that look, I think some of the hottest areas, which have been hot, it's not like a new thing, but so-called book club women's fiction. So like fiction that will get a group of people talking. So like ripped from the headlines, women's fiction, or on like the lighter ends of the spectrum, romantic comedies. Romantic comedies have experienced a huge surge in popularity the last like 5 years. And domestic suspense, I mean, that's something that like surged in popularity after Gone Girl, and like how many years has that been? Like it just seems to be that there's like an insatiable appetite for domestic suspense, psychological suspense. And then I mean it's always like, editors will also say like, I don't want to say I only want these specific categories, because there are things that are sort of category breaking and I'll know it when I see it. So, I also don't want to dissuade writers from writing what they're truly passionate about and feeling like they need to fit into these specific boxes, because,
Yeah.
there are plenty of books you can point to that don't fit into specific boxes, but are just amazing reads.
I think that that tends to be, it's funny that you say that. It tends to happen more and more. I like my most recent book deal is through Harlequin UK, and it was so interesting because over here in America, and this is writers, this is another great thing you can learn, is sometimes agents will go overseas to sell a project if it doesn't sell over here. And so this one is high fantasy but set on an alien planet with a little bit of science fiction thrown in. And so a lot of times publishers here were like, we don't know where to put this thing. Like it's but over, in the UK, they were like, oh, it's great. We'll take it. It's a mashup of everything. So you just never know where your book is going to land and what market
It's
it's going to end up
yeah,
in.
it's so true. And I have to say, congratulations. The UK market I find to be particularly hard. I don't usually find US based authors breaking into the UK market versus and not breaking in, like not getting a buyer in the US. Usually it's the other way. I'm usually like struggling to find a home in the UK. But yeah, it's like taste can be very different depending on the country.
Very.
So that's great. Yeah.
Have you ever had a book come across that is just so amazing or so intriguing to you, but you don't typically represent that genre, but you are like, I have to work on this. I have to have it. Does that happen very often?
Yes. I wouldn't say it happens often, but it does happen. Um, Actually, a couple of projects recently that I can't talk about because they haven't been announced, but yes. So I always keep an open mind when I'm looking at my queries, and if something pulls me in, it pulls me in, and I'm not, bound to representing specific categories. So I'm lucky that I can really take on whatever I love.
Does that make it harder knowing with all the experience that you have editing? Does it make it harder for you, do you think, to find clients and sign people on because you kind of know exactly what works and what doesn't work from the editorial side? Or do you think it makes it easier for you because you know what's going to hit and what might not hit?
Right. I th- I mean, it's hard to say because I've never experienced the side of business having not been an editor, but I do feel very fortunate to have had that experience on the editorial side. I mean, throughout every day as an agent, I think back to, okay, what would I have thought about this as an editor? And I have found that insight to be just invaluable now that I'm an agent. So everything from, will an editor want to acquire this, down the line to, is this piece of information something a publisher would want to know about their author? Or if I'm trying to make something happen for an author, what's the best timing in terms of asking a publisher to do this? Or, is this a reasonable request or an unreasonable request? I I wouldn't know those things if I hadn't been an editor.
Another frequently asked question is, how often do you get a submission where you feel like the book is done really well, like,
Mhm.
or you love the concept, you love the idea, but you feel like it's either the author has started in the wrong point in the story, um, or they've written it from the wrong perspective? Like, does it happen very
Mhm.
often? You're like, this concept is absolutely incredible, but there's just something off with the way it's written, but you've got to stick with it and figure it out. Like, does that happen very often where you know that a book has a chance, but they've
Mhm.
got to be willing to like take the leap and make a big change?
It does happen. But to be, I'm sure this is going to be discouraging to some writers, but every agent gets so many queries. So the reality is that if I am not pulled in the first few paragraphs, I
Mhm.
pass. So
How long do you give a book a chance personally before, when you're reading a sample, before you're like, "No, I'm moving on?" How long do they have to impress you?
I mean, if it's pulling me in, I keep going. But, I can usually tell in the first couple of paragraphs whether I think it's something I want to keep reading.
If you make it all the way to the end of a manuscript, are you pretty much locked in to give them an offer of rep, or are you still trying to decide?
Yeah, pretty much. If I've made it to the end, it's something I want to represent. It's very rare that I've read the whole thing, and I don't think I want to represent it.
So as we're closing in on the end here, this is probably one of my favorite questions to ask, and it's, is there one that got away?
Oh, yes. Um, yes.
From both sides, I'm
There
sure.
was one who I pursued, was it last summer? Yeah, it was a little bit less than a year ago, and multiple agents were after her, and she got away.
It's so painful. Have you seen the book come out yet?
It hasn't come out yet. I did see recently, like in the last few months, that it was sold, which does not surprise me at all. It was fantastic. I'm sure she has a bright career ahead of her. But yes, that one got
Okay.
away.
And, I'm sorry to bring it back up for you.
It's okay.
For the final question, I would love to answer this one that actually just came in. I know this is going to be hard to narrow down into a small answer, but are there any telltale signs that a submission is a no-go? What are some things that you're looking for immediately right off the bat that you're like, oh gosh, no, other
Mhm.
than grammatical issues and
Right. Um, ugh, well, I don't wanna be mean, but okay, look, I will just say it's best to just cut to the chase, right? Like, I wanna know what your book is about, and I wanna know your bio. That's
Mm,
basically the 2 most important things. Some authors will get a little too chatty, they'll talk about lots of irrelevant things before they really get to the meat of what I wanna see. And so that can be a turn off. If they submit something that I don't represent, so YA or um, poetry, I really don't take on, then that's a quick pass. Um,
Has there ever been a bio that's come across and just been so strangely weird or freaky that
uh, I mean, you can tell, like, that sort of actually ties into what I was saying with people like sort of going off course. You
Right.
can tell that like some people are just a little quirky and personality wise wouldn't be a good fit. So,
Mhm.
yes, that could be a turn off.
Lastly, before we go, thank you so much, first of all, for your time and,
Of course.
writers, those of you listening, this will be up for at least 90 days, so please come back. If you forgot to bring notes or notepad, I'm losing my mind right now, come back, listen to it again, write stuff down, or just get re-inspired by listening to someone that's been in the industry for 15 plus years. So Amy, my last question is, are you open to submissions right now? And if so, how can scribblers submit to you?
Yes, I'm always open to submissions. So the best way to reach me is through email. So my email address is atannenbaum@janerotrosen.com. I know that's a real mouthful. If you go to Jane Rotrosen Agency's website, you can find information on how to contact me and what I want in my query, which is always, synopsis, bio, and then the first 3 chapters of your project pasted into the body of an email.
Awesome. And what is something you would love to see come across your desk right now?
I love, oh my gosh, there's so much I would love to see, but look, I am looking for diverse voices always. Women's fiction that's sort of like in that sweet spot between literary and commercial. I love high concept romance, so something that might have a little bit of a speculative
Ooh,
component. Um, Big family dramas I love. I think those are, oh, domestic suspense. Always love domestic suspense. Yeah. So yeah, I would say those are my big items on my wish list these days.
awesome. Well, we are all out of time. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Thank you, Amy, for joining us. And we actually just posted in the chat, Scribblers, if y'all want to go down there, there is the link right here with Amy's email in the chat. So make sure to head on over there if you're interested in querying Amy. Thank you so much. This was amazing.
Thank you so much for having me.
We will see you next time, Scribblers.